Because there's a philosophy or theory around that, you get echoes from the future hitting the current timeline, if you want to call it that, if it's got a huge emotional response to it, because it has a bigger impact. It's almost like a ripple, a pebble being dropped into a pond. Those ripples come out, and it's kind of those things that you pick up. But I also think that human beings, by very nature, we're very cyclic anyway. I think most people get into patterns, so we tend to just do the obvious. I think. Do you know what I mean? It's even though we've got free will, we do tend to just go down the path that we're going to end up doing anyway. So that's just so interesting. It's so interesting. It must be such a scary thing to have that kind of thing, because it carries such a responsibility. On one hand, if you go out and tell the world that that's what you're seeing, the likelihood of doing that might actually change the future, because it's almost like I think there's a theory in quantum mechanics or whatever. If you observe something, it kind of changes or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah, the observer effect.
Yeah, the observer effect. So you could almost go out there as someone who gives a prophecy, and then it doesn't happen, and so therefore you look stupid. But then another event that's similar may happen, that's also just as ugly, because it's carrying the same energy footprint kind of thing. And then you're left looking really silly.
Well, one thing I didn't mention about those experiences that was quite interesting was that they both involved a kind of bluish grey colouring to my vision. So everything I saw looked bluish grey. So it was almost like I was seeing in a particular frequency, and that this bluish grey frequency seemed to have something to do with the nature of these experiences. And I've had 3 of these. I ended up calling them cerulean, because that's the particular shade of blue that they appear. And those particular experiences have all been accurate in terms of what I've seen through them. So they've been some of the more interesting or most interesting experiences in that sense, because they really challenge a lot of the ideas about how reality works and the whole thing. And they also opened me up to a whole range of spiritual ideas in terms of like compassion and social issues and things like that, because the more I thought about, like you're saying, the responsibility of seeing something like that, I thought about like what actually the actions, because both of these events were essentially terrorist attacks. So in both of those experiences, I got into this thinking of, why do people act in this kind of inhuman way? And that took me right back into thinking about my own background and my own youth, and why people were violent on the streets and the whole thing. So it became an opening up process of me looking at the whole concept of spirituality in general.
That's an interesting approach, isn't it? So you're trying to find the cause rather than to understand the experience better. I mean, on your journey, did you ever wonder why this happened to you? Have you ever kind of got to the bottom of it? Some people sort of go and see mystics or mediums, or some people kind of do their own intuitive open up to find out. But I mean, do you know why it's happened to you? Is it all come together like a big jigsaw puzzle in a way, that you're able to bring all this together with your art for some greater good?
Well, I definitely try to channel everything towards a greater good and use it towards an idea of spiritual evolution for people, and to try and offer ways that people can open up and transform. Because if someone who essentially was surrounded by crime and violence and drugs and all those kinds of things when I was growing up, if someone like me from that kind of background can use these things to completely transform who they are and their life, in a sense, then I think anyone can. So I think that's a really important message. And most books on spirituality don't really touch on those kinds of social issues to do with to do with growing up in a difficult situation in your childhood and things like that. So in my book, I really tried to look at. There's a whole chapter, for example, on the negative influences of growing up in London, and how they impacted me spiritually, and how I've now explored whole areas like non-violence and the whole concept of just living in a more peaceful way. So it's completely gone full circle in a way.
Yeah. I mean, so what about your peers that you've grown up with? Are they still in that kind of cycle, in that environment, or have they managed to sort of get themselves out of that as well?
Some people are still in the same kind of situation, and some people have ended up in prison and in bad situations and have not really moved forward. But some of my closest friends, interestingly, have also gone on a similar journey to some degree. Like, one of my closest friends is a healer now, despite growing up on an estate in East London and, you know, not having a very shining childhood as well. So he as well has been on a similar journey. And then I've got another friend who grew up again in the same sort of environment, but is now a teacher and lives in a different country and is very spiritual and has turned a lot of his life around. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely been that friend, for example, says that my experiences opened the door for him, in a sense, that it allowed him to open his horizons and think, well, there's more going on than kind of consumerism and these kind of limited worldviews that are around him.
I mean, you can be either sort of rich in material stuff, can't you, or you can be rich in spirituality. But it's kind of mad that people do, you know, a lot of degree that goes on. You think, are they aware that they're actually, you know, hindering their own spiritual progression? Because there's a lot of theories that these people know about stuff like this, but choose to ignore it. I mean, maybe the Earth plane is such an addiction, like it's almost hard to overcome. You know, it's like, or they know there's something better, there's something more spiritual on the horizon, but they just can't let go of all of the greed and, you know, the material wealth they want to keep.
Well, I think you've got such a huge amount of influence going on. If you just think about television on its own, just that it influences people so much. With even if they're critical about what they're watching, they're still being kind of pushed in a particular direction emotionally by what they're seeing. So you're always being framed and influenced by these kinds of media. So it's very hard when you're bombarded with that kind of thing day in, day out, to then say, oh, I'm not interested in that, I'm gonna explore spiritual things, because there's not that many hours in the day, and most people are working 8 hours a day. They get home, they put the TV on to try and relax a bit. You know, how much time is really left to think about other things, or to, you know, it's very few people have to be pushed in some way, I think, to break out of that, or to want to break out of that.
But when I mean, something like an OBE is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? It's just, you realise then that consciousness isn't inside the body. You know, it's something that's external to it. In some ways, are we actually ever in the body at all? You know, like, we think that we are looking out through our eyes. But are we? You know,
well,
I mean, has there been episodes where people have gone back into their body and they're upside down for a little while?
Not that I'm aware of.
Or is that just a myth?
Well, I'm not. I don't know. I mean, I think it's more to do with how someone perceives and believes in the world. I think it's to do with consciousness. I think that essentially every cell of who we are is interconnected with everything around us. You know, you could say on a quantum level. I think it's to do with quantum non-locality, or entanglement, which is this idea that particles are connected somehow instantly across any distance, or time, space is irrelevant. I think it's to do with that. There's a physicist called Brian Josephson who won the Nobel Prize, who has written a whole theory about how psychic abilities might be possible. using physics as the basis of his theory.